Second talk after lunch. Okay, this is the twilight shift. So if everyone can stay awake for this one, you'll be doing really well. So I'm going to talk about, so I'm Matt Pinkerton. I'm a principal scientist at NIWA. I'm also in charge of the Resample project, which is a 5-year endeavor fund project. We're kind of 3.5 years into that one, looking at the Ross Sea marine protected area. So in the talk, I'm going to give a little bit of my kind of view on why we would put in marine protected areas and how marine protected areas fit into our aims of conserving resilience, promoting resilience, conserving the marine environment. And then I'm going to say a little bit about how you do that, how some of the practical steps, similar to Carolyn's touched on, about how you bring climate change information into the design of MPAs. And then I'm going to talk about the Ross Sea MPA, which has got some nice pictures with it as well, if you can stay awake till then. So in terms of why, I think it's important to bear in mind that, protected areas don't protect things from the effects of climate change. The effects of climate change are going to happen. So what are we protecting from? So mainly what we're protecting from is the effects of fishing. Also other things like development, maybe aquaculture, maybe other kinds of human actions. The protection can stop that. So it can give things a bit of a space. It can move the fishing around or move the development to other areas where the impacts might be less. So in that way, the purpose of the spatial protection is linked to what the threat is. So in terms of fishing, Matt gave a really good talk on this. There's the environmental change that we're quite good on. We kind of can forecast to some extent anyway, how temperature is going to change, acidification, like Vonda talked about, the effects of waves, things like that. And they have direct effects on fishing. They change where fishing can happen. And they have effects on single species in terms of metabolic rates or areas or movement of species. And then they kind of combine and give you a sort of ecosystem response. And that feeds back into the effect on species. And that gets very tricky then. So here we are. This is a sort of Southern Ocean view about temperature change on the left-hand side, primary productivity change on the right-hand side. And you can see, we've got a lot of warming, they're the red colors. You can see actually for the Southern Ocean, there's more areas where productivity has been increasing over the last 20 years than where it's been decreasing. The Ross Sea area, which is the area down at the south there where it's purple, that's one of the few areas in the Southern Ocean where over the last 20 years, productivity has actually been going down. So for a large extent, if you're in the Southern Ocean, if you're a zooplankton, or if you're a lower trophic level species, climate change over the last 20 years has been pretty positive. There's more productivity around to kind of eat. We're also seeing the effects, of course, of extreme events. So these kind of changes of the average temperature don't really capture what's happening to the extreme events. So when the whole bell curve of temperature shifts slightly to the warming side, you get a massive increase in the number of extreme events. So that's why we're seeing more heat waves. So you can see, I wonder if I can show this. You see this massive heat wave. This is the kind of one in 2017, and that corresponded to this massive drop in productivity on the west coast of South Island. So changes to the physical environment lead to changes of the biological environment, and that then has ramifications on other species. And this is work that's not quite published yet, looking at around New Zealand, the intensity and the number and the severity of heat wave events around the New Zealand coast. And certainly we're seeing more intense heat waves, we're seeing more long-term heat waves, and we're seeing a greater number of heat waves playing out in different areas around New Zealand. So the trouble is that most of the fishing is on species that have a trophic level of about 4 and a bit, so kind of towards the top of the food web. In the Antarctic, it's even higher, maybe even 5. And what we're looking at in those satellite pictures and with the temperature and what we can predict more of is what's happening at the bottom of the food web to the phytoplankton. And the trouble is, there's a hell of a lot of difference. There's a hell of a long distance between the bottom of the food web and the top. There's maybe 2 or 3 extra species that the energy is going through before it gets to those top level predators that we're interested in, such as the polar bears up in the Arctic that we've heard about, some of the fish that we're fishing, the seals, the whales, the penguins. It's a long way away from those and the phytoplankton at the bottom of the food web. So really what we're struggling with is trying to understand how those changes down at the bottom of the food web push their way up through all these intervening species. And one of the problems is that we don't have very good information on all that stuff in the middle of the food web. You think about the squids, think about the octopods, the krill, You think about the zooplankton, the small fish, all the kind of crustaceans that live near the seabed. We're not very good on those. So what's likely to happen if we can't predict it? Movement of species, we've seen that from Matt. The change of species mixture. So where fishermen have been out and they've been able to fish in one area and catch a particular mix of species to match the quota, that's probably not going to work in the future. So there's going to be a change of that mixture. So it's going to be a poorer mix between what people are catching and what the quota is, which is a problem for management. There's going to be greater variability. So there's going to be winners and losers. Some species are likely to just collapse. So they've been fine for years being fished at a particular level and suddenly they kind of go belly up. New species are going to occur in different areas. Catch limits that we've used in the past are not going to be appropriate to the future. We've heard that before. Dramatic shifts in environmental conditions where the whole system reorganizes is certainly possible. So these are what's going to happen, probably. And we're into that kind of lack of predictability and quite significant effects. Where does spatial management fit in? And one thing to look at are the 10 Commandments that was published over a decade ago now, which are actually still really useful. Maintain age and spatial structure in fish populations. So how do spatial management help us to maintain that structure? Well, maybe a kind of protected area where the old fish are living gives the species space to have that proper age structure of the species, which gives it more resilience. Can we protect key life stages using spatial protection? So should we be fishing on spawning aggregation? That's a little bit of a different aspect, but that might be fitted into some kind of overarching spatial aspect to management of species. Habitats are absolutely crucial. So if the fishing isn't having an effect on the habitat, spatial protection isn't going to help. So if your area of corals is decreasing because of acidification, putting a protected area of that is not going to help that. But if that area is also being damaged by fishing, then you can create a refuge over that. And that is a sensible thing to do. So you've got to look at the sort of combined effects of the fishing and the climate change for designing, I think, appropriate spatial management. Protecting key prey species. So you might not want to protect an area that's really important for a fish that you're fishing, but maybe you protect the prey of that species. And of course, a lot of these species move, so we've got to know something about the movement of those. So it becomes very tricky. And be adaptive. So one of the messages which comes through is that in some ways, putting in the spatial protection is important because it allows us to monitor better and to understand what's going on, gives us sentinel sites, generates funding and time series so that we can keep going back and looking at areas and understanding what is changing. So just that way that spatial management can lead to better science and better data and better time series and a better understanding is also really important. So in terms of how you do this, this was a paper that was published in 2019, and I think this is really useful. It says you decide what you want to protect. So that's your conservation goals up at the top. You do some kind of assessment about where the best places to protect are. What are the threats? What are we actually going to try and change? And I think just taking climate change into account when you do that vulnerability assessment misses the fact that you've also got to take into account what you're protecting against. So you've got to take into account the effects of fishing and other development that might happen, and then design it in some way. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then there's a feedback loop where you actually monitor that and you see whether your spatial management is having the effect that you want and if things are changing. And that's the feedback through management. And then you go around that loop again and you kind of adapt your protected areas. So in terms of how, this is usually what's done. This is the work, a lot of the work that Carolyn was talking about. You take maps of what's happening in the present day. You look at connectivity of those different things, so where the species are, which features are, where your habitats are. You produce spatial maps of those. You put in some cost data. So by putting a spatial protection area in one place, how much is that going to displace fishing? How much is it going to cost the human use part of that? And then you do an analysis and you come up with some optimal solution about where to put the MPA. So that's fine. That's kind of what we do at the moment. How do you take climate change into that? Well, one way is you do all that and then you take future projections about where these things are going to move to and what things are going to be like in the future. And then you look at that best design that you have, and you look at how that works under these different scenarios. And then you say, how robust is that particular design to what we think is going to happen in the future? And then you can go around that and try a different design and see whether you can get something that's more robust. The other way is you can add in information at the design stage about what you think the future changes are going to be. So instead of putting in just the present day distribution of the species, you put in what you think that distribution is going to be in the future. And you wrap all that up into the optimization procedure. And then you come out with a solution that's going to protect those changes that are going to happen in the future as well. This is a method that's kind of being used more at the moment. So I'm going to go on to the Ross Sea MPA now. It's going to be a little bit of a Ross Sea fishery 101 at the start. Some people might know a lot about this, some people not so much. So Antarctic toothfish, which we're talking about, this is the species that's caught down in the Ross Sea, was the first discovered really in terms of it being a target for commercial fishing by one New Zealand fishing vessel back in 1997. So it's very recent. Then it increased to 2 vessels, and now there's more than 20 vessels going down there. This is what it looks like. So Antarctic toothfish is a large species, grows to over 2 meters in length. The Antarctic toothfish, not to be confused with Patagonian toothfish, also known as Chilean sea bass, served on menus around the world. Antarctic toothfish is the real Antarctic specialist. Patagonian toothfish is more out in the high seas in slightly warmer water. It's taken by longline, especially in the Ross Sea region. That's kind of like the major area that Antarctic toothfish occurs in the Antarctic. This is how the pattern of fishing has gone. So you can see the fishery started back in 1997. It ramped up very quickly. And the black line on that one is the catch limit. So it hit the catch limit back in 2004. So I remember being involved in this early on when we were getting the first stock assessment together for this. And there was a real rush to try and get a catch limit on before it started to blow out. So usually the pattern of new fisheries like this is that catch keeps rising, there's no limit on it, and then the whole thing collapses. So that hasn't happened with toothfish in the Ross Sea. We managed to get that catch limit in place early on, and then it's stuck at that level more or less ever since. On the right-hand side of that picture, you'll see where we are in terms of the size of the stock. So the fishery, the toothfish fishery in the Antarctic is managed by CCAMLR, which is a sort of international organization for fisheries in the Southern Ocean. And they set a limit of not more than 50% depletion of the spawning stock level. And that's what we're heading to. So at the moment, we're about 70% the unfished level. And in the next 20 years, that's going to fall to about 50%. Now, you know, I can talk for a long time about whether 50% is a good limit or a bad limit. In my opinion, it's too much depletion. Other people would say it's not enough. If it was fished in New Zealand, it would be fished down to about 40%, maybe even 35%. So it's more conservative than would happen if it was in the EEZ. But you could argue it's still too much of a risk. And one reason why it's a bit of a risk is because the Ross Sea is a pretty special place. It's one of the least modified shelf ecosystems in the world. It's got a lot of seals, it's got a lot of whales. And also the CCAMLR principles, CCAMLR was set up with a very green mandate. So not only have you got to not collapse the stock, you've also not got to disrupt the ecosystem. You've got to protect ecosystem relationships in the Ross Sea. The third principle of CCAMLR is that any changes due to fishing have got to be reversible within 20 to 30 years. So it's quite a green mandate, CCAMLR. You could argue greener than the New Zealand fishing regulations, for instance. The Ross Sea has also got maybe 30% of the world's Antarctic seabirds in it. Huge numbers of emperor penguins, Adelie penguins, a lot of other seabirds as well. It's got a complex ecosystem, obviously, and we've identified kind of 5 major risks to the ecosystem from fishing down there: on the bycatch species, on the prey of toothfish, on the predators of toothfish, particularly killer whales, Weddell seals and sperm whales, and these cascading ecosystem effects and effects on habitat. And unfortunately, there's not very good information to protect or mitigate these effects at the moment. So that's where the Ross Sea MPA came in. It was agreed in 2016, came into force in 2017. It's taken more than 10 years of scientific and diplomatic work to get this through. When you've got 26 countries involving Russia and China and Japan, Ukraine, European Union, and they all have to agree unanimous to set up an MPA, it becomes quite a big geopolitical scientific puzzle to kind of nail. So New Zealand and the US proposed this one. At the time, it was the biggest MPA established in the world. And it's got, in terms of the objectives, it's got four kind of main objectives. One is to protect key species and ecosystem processes, to conserve representative ecological structure and function. So you've seen this kind of terminology comes up in a lot of MPAs around the world. Mitigate threats. So that was the one that carried a lot of weight within CCAMLR, where you've got very strong fishing nations, and stimulate and support research to understand the effects of fishing and climate change in the Ross Sea. And then how do you do this? How do you actually get something like this agreed? Well, then you've got to drill down into the detail, and there'll be a little diversion here into the detail. So from those four kind of overarching objectives, you produce 11 specific objectives. And then for those specific objectives, you break them down into sub-objectives. And for each of them, so for instance, if you're going to protect predators of toothfish, for instance, you then look at which are the predators of toothfish. So you narrow that down into the particular predators of toothfish. And then you say, where do those predators live? Can we kind of narrow that down and put some maps in place and look at which areas protect which proportions of these different features? So there's a lot of detail that comes into this. So you can see in terms of ecosystem processes, it's broken down into particular features. And for each of those, then we try and get maps of those. Okay, so here's maps of kind of like things like the frontal features, where the high productivity is, where the prey species are, so the Antarctic krill and the crystal krill and the silverfish, where the penguins are and where they forage. You see all the foraging information that was brought in. Where the toothfish are, so the life cycle of toothfish. So toothfish are moving around in the area, so how do they move and which areas of their life cycle are we protecting? Where is the benthic habitat that we want to protect from the effects of fishing? Bioregionalizations, this is the benthic bioregionalization, is also a pelagic one. And then you kind of go, right, here we've got our objectives, we've got our maps of those. Now we've got our cost layers from where the fishing works. We'll take input from the fishing industry throughout about where they want to see protection and where they don't, because it will impact their bottom line. We'll put those into some optimization process and we'll come up with some designs. And then you gather all the nations around and they debate it in the politics of where they're going to do. So these are, and Debbie Freeman can talk more about all the politics of how this went on. The 2013 proposal, the 2014 proposal, 2015 joint proposal, the 2016 joint proposal, which was actually accepted. And you can see how that changed and different parts were added and taken away. Now this is for the Ross Sea. CCAMLR are committed to a network of protected areas around the Southern Ocean. So you can imagine all these developments are now playing out in 7 other domains around the Antarctic. And the thing about the Ross Sea MPA is that climate change wasn't included in that design. And the way that's taken into account is that we've got to monitor it and we've got to report back on CCAMLR, and there's got to be decisions taken about whether we adapt that to the effects of climate change. This is the process by which CCAMLR are going to talk about that one, the planning, the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluation, and then the adjustment of the MPA. So that's going to go on for the next 35 years. And at the end of that 35-year period, all the countries have got to agree again to maintain the MPA for it to continue beyond that time. So it's not an MPA in perpetuity. So this is the Resample project, which I kind of am leading. And the idea of this is to feed some of that information that CCAMLR need and the effects of climate change and the effects of fishing, and take that forward and say, how is things changing? Is the MPA working? Does it need to be adjusted? Too much to go into now. So there you are. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk. And hopefully we've got time for a couple of questions.